So, this is a video coming out the day before Thanksgiving, and the reason I'm making this video is because I've had this idea rolling around in my head. And the idea that I've had is, with seeing how, in my opinion, the state of Final Fantasy these days is atrociously bad, how to bring it back? What type of Final Fantasy would I make if I had, absolute control over everything and could, quote-unquote, fix it? So, this video is about that. But before I can go into how I would fix Final Fantasy, I first have to talk about what Final Fantasy is and how it's kind of gone downhill as of late. So, let's get into it after the cut. So, I guess we have to begin with talking about what is Final Fantasy, and how did it get in the state that it is now. So, Final Fantasy is a series that began in the third gen in the mid-1980s. And basically, its title comes from the fact that Squaresoft had, the company that originally created the franchise before it was merged with Enix and became Square Enix. Squaresoft essentially came up with an idea to create a... they had created several games that just didn't really do all that well, and so they basically came up with the idea, well, we're going to have to find some way to make some money. So they said to themselves, hey, we'll make one last game, and if it doesn't do well, it'll be our final game. So it was called Final Fantasy, the final dream that maybe we can make a game that'll do well. And Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team were in charge of it, and they made Final Fantasy. And Final Fantasy came out, and while it did okay in Japan, it did gangbusters around the world, because Final Fantasy did something that had not been done before. Final Fantasy came out after Dragon Quest, and Dragon Quest, while personally I think it's overall the series is better than Final Fantasy in my opinion as it is right now. Dragon Quest came from Enix, and the thing about Enix is that Enix was very their first games were PC games, and if you play Final Fantasy, you can tell that, or Dragon Quest, not Final Fantasy. If you play Dragon Quest, you can tell that the first Dragon Quest games are very based off of PC gameplay versus console gameplay, which, you press a button and you have to do everything, you press a button and, you have to take a chance and, open up a menu in order to do anything. It's like, oh, you want to talk to someone, okay, you have to open up a menu in order to talk to someone. Oh, you want to do this, you gotta open up a menu if you want to search something. You have to open up a menu if you want to save. You want to open up a menu if you want to go in the inventory. It's very tedious. Final Fantasy basically shortened a lot of that. It made it easier to get into RPGs, so it did better in the West. Compared to even PC-based RPGs back in the day. So, that's a good thing. That's amazing. It's a good thing that happened. So with that being said, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for Final Fantasy? So, essentially, Final Fantasy for each console gen, as long as Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team were running the franchise, third gen, fourth gen, fifth gen, you basically were getting 3 Final Fantasies per console. So you got 3 Final Fantasies during the third gen, even though only 2 came to America. 3 came out. Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 3. In America, we only got Final Fantasy 1 and 2. Or was it 1? No. Yeah, I think it was only 1. Maybe 2. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've played these games, and I'm doing this extemporaneously. So, so Final Fantasy is this big thing that came out and did a lot of really good things to help make the franchise a big deal. So with that being said, you got 3 Final Fantasies per console generation. Final Fantasy 3 Once the 4th gen came, you got Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6. Here in America, it was released as Final Fantasy 2. I'm not sure why it was released as Final Fantasy 2, but it was. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan of Final Fantasy 2. Or not Final Fantasy 2. I'm not the biggest fan of the naming convention. I think we could have gotten those Final Fantasies. Final Fantasy 5 and Final Fantasy 6. Now, in America, instead of getting Final Fantasy 5, we got Final Fantasy Mystic Quest because Square Enix thought we were too dumb to figure out how to play an RPG. So they made an RPG for dummies. So, I've never been that big of a fan of that particular philosophy when it comes to gaming. I don't like people treating me like I'm an idiot. Which is what they did. They basically were like, oh, you're too stupid to know how to play an RPG. Not cool with that, but that's neither here nor there. So then we go from the 5th gen to the 6th gen, from the 4th gen to the 5th gen, which is Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. And, we go to the 6th gen, which, I think we only got one game from Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team, which is kind of sad. Final Fantasy X, which to me, Final Fantasy X, I used to hate that game because I hated the main character, but looking at it now, Final Fantasy X is not a bad game. It's just the main character is kind of a trash main character, but it is what it is. So Hironobu Sakaguchi is forced to resign by Square Enix because Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, the movie, the crappy Final Fantasy movie that should have been obvious that it wasn't going to do well because Hironobu Sakaguchi knew how to make video games. He did not make movies, and movies and video games are two completely different mediums. The man is basically fired. He's forced to resign, so he's fired in all but name. And we go to what I like to call the Dark Age of Final Fantasy. Well, almost the Dark Age. We got one last good Final Fantasy game, in my opinion. And that was Final Fantasy XII. But Final Fantasy XII, technically speaking, is not a Final Fantasy game. And I'll get into that once I get to the state of Final Fantasy and how it got to this point. So that's basically Final Fantasy as it was. You got 3 Final Fantasies per console gen, all of which were of quality. Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 3 on the NES were good. Final Fantasies 2, 3, 4, and 5 also good. And look, I know that not all these games were localized, but if you go back and play the numerous ports they have of those games, they're solid. They're solid games. And especially if you manage to put yourself into the point of view of someone who was playing those games back in the day, they're good. There's nothing wrong with those titles. So with that being said, I'll talk into how it got into this state after the cut. So, Final Fantasy, like I said, is a franchise that each console gen, you got 3 Final Fantasies. So, during the 3rd gen, the NES life cycle, that console was around for, officially, if you include Japan and the US, the Famicom came out in '84, and it was officially supported until '92. So that was 8 years. So in 8 years, we got 3 Final Fantasy games, all right, from Square Enix. Okay. Not, every year, but basically over 8 years, you got 3 games. The Super Nintendo was supported from 91 to 97, I believe, 97. So over 6 years, you got 3 Final Fantasies, And during the 5th gen, the PlayStation era, the PlayStation was supported up until I think a year or 2 into the life cycle of the PlayStation 2. So you got 3 Final Fantasies. So essentially, you got a lot of Final Fantasies under Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team. But what happened was that Square Enix, due to politics and not wanting to be quote-unquote constrained by Nintendo anymore, basically got in bed with Sony, and Final Fantasy essentially, they got the big head, for lack of a better word. They got arrogant, they got extraordinarily arrogant, and they felt that they could do whatever they wanted. They were like, well, we're going to take Final Fantasy and turn it into a movie. And they got the person who helped them turn Final Fantasy into a golden cow, Hironobu Sakaguchi, to be the producer of it. Not realizing that just because you have Final Fantasy doesn't mean you're going to be able to make a Final Fantasy movie, especially back then. And I still will not admit, I still don't think Final Fantasy would make a good movie, because the thing about Final Fantasy is that it's an RPG, and RPGs are about your story. It's about what you're doing as the player character, and you cannot translate what the player character would do into what you would do in a movie. It just doesn't work. But that's neither here nor there. Final Fantasy essentially comes out, and it is the Spirit Within comes out, and it's a bomb. It comes out and it loses a lot of money. As a matter of fact, it loses so much money that Square Enix is in danger of going bankrupt. Sorry, Squaresoft. So much so that they force Hironobu Sakaguchi to resign, which wasn't a smart move, because, this is the man who, aside from this bad movie, has basically helped to make their game into a thing. But that's just, that's bad management. That's someone who does not know how to run a successful company. So essentially, they force him out, and he takes his team with him. So all of the quote unquote A team who made Final Fantasies and knew how to make Final Fantasies left. But not only did the A team leave, the B team left. The B team later went off and became Monolith Soft. And they worked for Namco Bandai, where they made Xenosaga and Xenogears and Baten Kaitos and stuff like that. And they got in bed with Nintendo. They were made into a first-party studio by Nintendo, and the rest is history. But you get what I'm saying, that all of the high-quality, most talented developers on the Final Fantasy franchise left Square Enix. So there was literally the people who knew how to make it weren't there anymore. So they had to start from scratch. And their first try wasn't that bad, because, well, it was bad because they made Final Fantasy the MMO, Final Fantasy 11. Now here's the problem, okay? MMOs, even back then, were notoriously expensive to create. And it's expensive. And Final Fantasy as a single player game doesn't really lend itself, in my opinion, to, what I like to call the single player, not single player, it doesn't lend itself to a MMO. People would think it does, but it really doesn't, because, like I said, Final Fantasy is your story. It's your characters creating this massive world, going on adventures, all that type of fun stuff. It doesn't really feel right to, have a game where you can't do that type of stuff. But that's neither here nor there. So, Final Fantasy 7 comes out, Final Fantasy 11 comes out, and Final Fantasy 11 is essentially like this, personally, I never thought that game was very good. It's very archaic. The gameplay is really old school. I remember going out and playing that game during the free month trial. I think when they had an offer, you get a free month gameplay. And I remember being level 7 after doing a lot of town quests, and then going out in the field and fighting a low-level enemy, and literally having to, getting destroyed after 1 or 2 hits, and having to group up with people who also were around the same level to take on a low-level enemy, level 1. and it took an entire group of us to take out one enemy. And I was like, this is trash. This is like incredibly badly made. But, you know, and then we go from there to Final Fantasy XII, the next proper installment in the franchise, which is, I mean, Final Fantasy XII, like I said earlier in the previous segment, technically should not be called a Final Fantasy game because it isn't. It's Final Fantasy XII is in fact it's a Final Fantasy Tactics game, okay? Because it's basically set in the same space as Final Fantasy Tactics. It's set in Ivalice, the world that Ivalice is in. There's another game in that in that series that's also set in Ivalice, Vandal Hearts. Vandal Hearts is also set in that universe. So, you know, all three of those games, well, at this point, 5, because there's Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, Final Fantasy Tactics A2, Vandal Hearts, and now Final Fantasy XII, which isn't really a Final Fantasy game, it's a Final Fantasy Tactics RPG. That's basically what it is. So, like, Final Fantasy XII, not really a Final Fantasy game. Has the title, but not really a Final Fantasy game. So then we go from 12 to 13 in that trilogy, which is when it hits the skids, because we get 3 Final Fantasies and all of them are atrociously bad. Final Fantasy 13 is bad, Final Fantasy 13-2 is bad, Final Fantasy 13-3 is bad. And, you know, the guy who created those games, instead of trying to make a good game, you know, he was at a press conference when they were hyping up the next Final Fantasy game, and instead of talking about how he's going to make a good Final Fantasy, you know, they're like, what are you doing to improve the title? He says, well, I'm going to make Zero's bust size bigger. She's going to go up a cup. Now, I'm a heterosexual male. I, you know, like a busty woman, and, but, you know, in game development, who in the world, who in the gaming god world would actually care, like, is saying, man, in order to make this game good, the main character needs to have a bigger bust size. I mean, if I was in control, if I was running that company, I would have fired his behind right there. Like, you gotta go. Get your stuff, get out of here. Because you clearly don't know how to make this. You don't know how to make a good game. So basically, Final Fantasy as it is right now, you know, and don't get me started with 14, which when it first came out, they had to basically destroy that game in order to make it good again. So that was a failure. It's on the right track now, but you shouldn't have to do that to a game in order to make it into a viable franchise. And Final Fantasy 15, which once again, a Final Fantasy game, which isn't really a Final Fantasy game. It's more like an action game with some Final Fantasy tropes thrown into it, but that doesn't make it Final Fantasy. So, essentially, the reason Final Fantasy is as it is right now is because there's no one to really run Final Fantasy the way that Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team did. The most talented people who knew how to make RPGs like that left the company. So what you have now is essentially there's no one to really take up the mantle and make good Final Fantasy games. That's essentially what's going on. And so what you get is just a continuous pile of trash, in my opinion. Final Fantasy, like I said, in my humble opinion, has not been good in years. Final Fantasy 13 is a travesty. 13-2, just as bad. 13-3, worse. And you've got no one who can really run the franchise the way it needs to be run. You've got no one who's making the games that need to be made. So, you know, I mean, it kind of upsets me because, you know, Final Fantasy used to be one of my go-tos as an RPG lover. Like, man, I can always count on Final Fantasy. Nope. You know, the only JRPG, old school JRPG franchise that still has some quality left to it is Dragon Quest. Because Dragon Quest, arguably, you can say Dragon Quest 10, which never was localized, is the one black mark on the franchise. The other games are solid. Final Fantasy has had a string of bad games, or games that just weren't really Final Fantasy in terms of, you know, encouraging people to learn how to play these games, get into the weeds of how to play them properly, how to utilize different skills and abilities, how to do planning for how you're going to build your character. None of that matters in current Final Fantasies. It's just it's trash. So you know, that's how it got to this state, in my opinion. You know, this is just me looking at, you know, the empirical. This is me observing what's happened to Square Enix over the last few years. Okay, if you disagree, that's cool. You don't have to agree, but that's my opinion. So with that being said, the next segment after the cut. So here we go. So this video is running a little bit long, so I'm going to cut it in half, and this will be part one, where I just talk about the state of Final Fantasy and what Final Fantasy is, the state of it, and how it got to where it is. In part two, I will go in depth about how I would save Final Fantasy. So with that being said, part one will be dropping today, part two will be dropping tomorrow or Thursday. So that being said, rate, comment, share, subscribe. We will not be having a BS Busters tomorrow or Saturday. We will pick back up on BS Busters December 4th. Alright? So, December 4th, we'll be back with BS Busters. So that'll be Wednesday, December 4th. So, that being said, that's the end of the video. Peace!